I had a coffee last week with a friend's younger brother. He's one of those people who just radiates competence. 25 years old, a brilliant engineer, already managing a small team at a major tech firm. He was telling me about a new AI project he was working on, and his face lit up with that specific kind of energy you only see in people who truly believe they're building the future. He was, in every sense, the kind of person you'd bet a country's future on. So when I asked him what his next big career move was, I was expecting to hear about a promotion or a new venture. Instead, he gave a quiet, tired smile and said, "Germany, my papers just came through. I'm leaving." I was taken aback. He had everything going for him right here. When I asked why, he didn't mention salary or lifestyle. He just told me a short story about how he'd recently been passed over for a crucial promotion. It wasn't about performance. He was the top candidate by every metric. The person who got the job simply had the right last name. He said it with no anger, just a flat, exhausted sense of finality. It's not a glass ceiling, he told me. It's a steel grid. And it's not based on what you can do. It's based on who you were born as. That conversation stuck with me. This wasn't just one person's disappointment. It felt like watching a country willingly export its own future, all in service of a system that has become a national addiction. That story, I think, it just perfectly captures the intense friction at the heart of our deep dive today. This whole conversation about meritocracy, caste, opportunity in India, it's probably one of the most fraught yet, well, fundamentally important national debates anywhere in the world, really.
It absolutely is. And the system your friend felt blocked by, that steel grid he mentioned, it really stems from India's reservation policy. We're talking about the world's most extensive, certainly the oldest, and maybe the most deeply rooted system of affirmative action anywhere.
Yeah.
It was designed, its origin was explicitly to address centuries of social injustice, of exclusion, particularly based on caste identity.
So our goal today, what we want to do, is really rigorously analyze the core tension here. Because on one side, you've got this undeniable constitutional mandate for equity trying to right historical wrongs, But on the other side, there's this really pervasive narrative, you hear it all the time, that this very policy is actively eroding meritocracy, it's threatening national unity, causing huge economic damage, and maybe most visibly, driving the country's best and brightest abroad. That whole brain drain argument.
Yeah, exactly. And we really need to try and get beyond let's say, the political shouting points. We're going to analyze those claims of economic damage, look at some hard empirical evidence. There's a fascinating study on Indian Railways productivity we should definitely get into.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Our mission, if you like, is to dissect this complex web of reasons why highly skilled professionals might choose to leave and stick really strictly to the data, to the evidence, to understand the true impact of this perceived steel grid.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the modern arguments, the current debates, we first have to appreciate just how deep the historical roots of this policy go. I think many people assume reservation is purely a post-independence thing, something baked into the Constitution. But the actual practice, reserving seats, it goes back much further.
That's completely true. These quota systems, they weren't invented by the Republic in 1950. You can find examples way back in the British Raj. For instance, back in 1902, the Maharaja of Pholapur introduced a 50% reservation for what were termed backward communities in his state services.
50% back in 1902.
50%. And then a bit later, 1918, you had Mysore's Raja Nalvadi Krishna Raja Wadiyar implementing specific reservations for non-Brahmins, again in government jobs and education. And, this often faced significant pushback, usually from the existing administrative elite, the Brahmins predominantly, at the time.
So even before independence, there was already this precedent, this idea that the state could or maybe should intervene to balance social representation. Then independence happens, the Constitution is drafted.
Exactly. And the Constitution really solidified this foundation. It formally outlawed untouchability, which was huge, and it explicitly enshrined the power for the state to, proactively address this historical exclusion. You look at Articles 15, 4, and 46, they gave the state the direct power to make special provisions for the advancement of what they called socially and educationally backward classes. Initially, that focus was very much on scheduled castes, the SCs, and scheduled tribes, the STs.
Right. But the massive expansion, the one that really created the system that, causes most of the arguments today, the one that dramatically ramped up the whole quota system that came much later, with the Mandel Commission in the 80s, right?
Yes, the Mandel Commission. It was set up in 1979, and its task was basically to figure out the situation for all the other socially and educationally backward classes, beyond just the SCs and STs. They hit a bit of a snag, though they didn't have precise contemporary census data.
So what did they use?
They ended up having to rely on census data from way back in 1931. And based on that older data, they estimated that these other backward classes, the OBCs, made up something like 52% of India's population at the time.
52%. And their recommendation based on that figure, that was the political bong show, wasn't it?
It really was. They recommended a 27% quota specifically for these OBCs, but only in union government services and public sector jobs. This recommendation was eventually implemented amidst huge controversy in the 1990s.
Okay, so let's do the math. You already had reservations for SCs and STs.
Right, about 22.5% was already allocated for SCs and STs in central institutions. You add this new 27% for OBCs.
And bang, you're immediately at 49.5%.
Exactly, 49.5%, which put it right up against a very important legal threshold that was about to be established.
And that brings us neatly to the whole issue of legal ceilings, the constant expansion, because that 50% cap, which the Supreme Court famously set in the 1992 Indrasani ruling, the Mandel case judgment that was put in place specifically to preserve this idea of equal access, equal opportunity for all citizens, wasn't it?
That 50% ceiling, for a long time, was really seen as, well, almost inviolable, the legal line in the sand, you could say. But that's not really the case anymore. It's now being routinely surpassed or sort of legally maneuvered around.
How so? What's the biggest change recently?
The most significant recent expansion, without a doubt, is the 10% quota for economically weaker sections, the EWS quota. And the crucial thing here is that this applies to the general category, meaning people who aren't covered by the existing SC, ST, or OBC reservations.
Right, so it's a quota for people outside the traditional reservation groups based purely on economics, and the Supreme Court actually upheld this.
It did. In 2022, the Supreme Court upheld the EWS quota. And that single addition, that 10%, pushed the total reservation in central government institutions up to 59.50%. So decisively breaking that historical 50% ceiling and, arguably opening the door for potentially even more expansion down the line.
59.5% at the central level. But that's not even the whole story, is it? Because the states have their own systems.
Oh, absolutely. And some states have pushed those limits much, much further, often using specific state legislation or even constitutional amendments shielded from easy judicial review. Tamil Nadu is maybe the classic example. Historically, they've maintained a huge 69% caste-based reservation system.
69%.
Yes. And just last year, I think it was, the state of Bihar increased its total quota percentage to a really staggering 75%.
75%? Wow. So the legal landscape is just constantly shifting. That 50% cap feels more like a guideline now, maybe.
It certainly seems less rigid than it once was. And you also saw the Supreme Court ruling just this year, in 2024, which basically permitted states to create subquotas within the existing SC and ST reservations.
What does that mean, subquotas?
It means states can now carve out smaller quotas within the larger SC/ST percentage for specific, particularly marginalized groups within those categories. So it allows for, let's say, finer tuning, trying to address the really deep inequalities that might exist even among the broader reserved groups.
Okay, so it's an attempt at nuance, trying to make sure the benefits reach the most needy within those groups.
Exactly. And that attempt at nuance is what makes the whole system so incredibly complex, especially when you start talking about things like the creamy layer.
Ah, yes, the creamy layer. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a pretty sensible idea, right? A necessary mechanism to stop the already well-off members of a backward community from grabbing all the reserved spots generation after generation to make sure the benefits actually trickle down.
That was precisely the intention when the Supreme Court established the concept back in '92 in that same Indrasani judgment. It's meant to be a qualitative exclusion based on socioeconomic status to ensure there's equity within the equity measure itself. But here's the crucial point. It applies only to the OBCs. It does not apply to SCs or STs.
Only OBCs, not SC/STs. Okay, that seems odd. But first, how is the creamy layer actually defined for OBCs? What makes someone creamy?
Well, there are basically two main ways someone can be excluded from the OBC quota under the creamy layer rule. First is occupational status. So the children of high-ranking government officials, think IAS, IPS officers, Class I officers, and also high-level professionals like doctors, lawyers, engineers, their children are generally excluded regardless of their actual income.
Okay, so based on parents' jobs, what's the second way?
The second is income. If your annual family income is above a certain threshold, currently it's $8,000 per year, then you're also excluded. 8 lakhs.
8 lakhs. But I remember reading something, there's a critical detail here, isn't there, about how that income is calculated.
Yes, and this is where it gets really controversial. That 8,000 income calculation specifically excludes income from salaries in agriculture.
It excludes salary and agricultural income. Wait. So a high-ranking government officer whose child might be excluded anyway because of the job role?
Potentially, yes.
Or, say, a large landowner whose wealth comes mainly from agriculture, they might still be considered non-creamy if their non-salary, non-agricultural income is below 8 lakhs, even if their total wealth is substantial.
That's the implication, yes. This specific exclusion is, well, highly contentious. It arguably tries to protect certain professions or income sources common in rural areas, but it also seems to create these potential loopholes for families who might be quite wealthy overall, but derive their income from these excluded sources.
That does seem to undermine the whole point of measuring socioeconomic advancement if you ignore two of the biggest sources of wealth for many people in India. And then we come back to that core friction point you mentioned. The creamy layer concept does not apply to SCFT groups at all.
Correct. And this uneven application is a major flashpoint in legal and social debates. The argument for applying it to SCs and STs is, well, if the real goal is to lift up the most disadvantaged within those communities, why should families who have already achieved significant economic power generation after generation within the SC/ST groups continue to occupy the reserved seats indefinitely?
Right.
In fact, one Supreme Court justice, even in concurring with that 2024 ruling on subquotas, explicitly stated that the creamy layer concept should logically be extended to SCs and STs as well. So it confirms this is still a very live, very significant point of legal and social argument. It just shows how difficult it is to define equity when you're constantly trying to define who is least backward or most deserving.
Okay, let's use that. That complicated reality of defining backwardness as our pivot point. Because if defining social backwardness is tricky, defining concepts like merit and efficiency is, well, arguably just as fraught. We absolutely have to analyze these claims that reservation policies fundamentally compromise merit, that they lead to serious economic damage, create massive inefficiencies across critical sectors.
This is definitely the loudest, most persistent criticism you hear. The argument goes that forcing institutions, especially in technical fields or government services, to select candidates who might have lower entrance scores or qualifications directly leads to poor performance, a general decline in standards, and in some narratives, even serious public danger.
Yeah, you often hear these really vivid claims, though, as you say, often unsubstantiated, trying to link reservation directly to specific failures, like those past accusations, connecting reservation policies to an increase in railway accidents.
Exactly. That kind of argument is obviously designed to, well, shock the public, to turn an issue of social justice into one of immediate personal safety. But the defense of affirmative action is equally strong. Advocates argue, quite forcefully, that this idea of a pre-existing pure meritocracy, especially in a society as stratified as India, is largely a myth anyway. Caste-based exclusion was, and often still is, rampant.
So the counter-argument is?
The counter-argument is that affirmative action actually fosters diversity. And diversity in itself can generate efficiency gains. Why? Because individuals from backgrounds that were previously excluded bring different skills, different life experiences, different perspectives to the table. And this can actually improve organizational decision-making, problem-solving, and ultimately performance.
Okay, so we have the theoretical arguments on both sides. But we don't have to just rely on theory here, do we? You mentioned earlier there's some compelling empirical evidence that speaks directly to this performance and efficiency debate. Let's really dig into that study on the Indian railways.
Yes, this study is particularly crucial, I think. Because Indian Railways, is one of the world's largest employers, and it's entirely subject to these affirmative action policies for SCs and STs. It's been implementing them for decades. So researchers took a deep dive into IR's efficiency data, spanning a really long period over 2 decades, from 1980 right through to 2002.
And what were they looking for specifically?
They were specifically trying to test that core criticism. Is there a negative correlation? Does increasing the percentage of employees hired under reservation negatively impact overall productivity or productivity growth?
Okay, the million rupee question then. What did they actually find? Did the critics have a point? Did reservations damage productivity on the railways?
Well, the key finding was essentially a direct refutation of that standard narrative. The analysis found no evidence whatsoever. Let me repeat that. No evidence to support the claim that increasing the proportion of SCST employees adversely affected overall productivity or the rate of productivity growth within Indian Railways during that period.
No negative impact at all, despite the massive scale and complexity of the railways.
None that their analysis could detect. The system, despite the reservations, didn't collapse, didn't become grossly inefficient according to their metrics.
Okay, that in itself is a fundamental counter-narrative. It suggests the system isn't necessarily the paralyzing force that the public debate often paints it as. But you said there was more, something even more surprising.
Yes, indeed. The results were actually even more positive when they drilled down into the most critical roles. When the researchers look specifically at the top-tier managerial and professional jobs, these are Category A and Category B posts, the leadership and decision-making roles crucial for the whole organization's health.
What did they find there?
They found a statistically significant positive association, meaning a higher proportion of SCST employees in these top management and professional categories was associated with higher overall IR productivity and faster productivity growth.
Wait, higher productivity? How does that work? That seems to challenge decades of assumptions. If the system selects people who, by definition of the quota, often entered with lower comparative cutoff scores, why would they potentially perform better in demanding managerial roles?
It's a fascinating finding, isn't it? The researchers themselves put forward three main potential drivers for this positive association. The first is essentially a high motivation factor. Some call it the prove them wrong effect.
Okay.
Individuals from marginalized groups who've succeeded against the societal narrative that maybe they're less competent, they're often incredibly motivated to excel once they get the opportunity. They might work harder, strive for greater perfection, show more resilience than their peers, maybe leading to superior output or better management.
Right. That makes intuitive sense. It speaks to the human element, that drive to overcome skepticism and really validate the chance they've been given. What's the second driver?
The second relates potentially to supervision effectiveness. The idea is that bringing managers and professionals from disadvantaged backgrounds into these high-level positions might actually increase overall organizational productivity, because they might be more effective at supervising and motivating other workers who come from similar communities. They might bridge cultural gaps, improve communication, reduce labor friction in ways that traditional management structures, often dominated by upper castes, might miss.
Okay, so they act as a bridge within the workforce itself. Makes sense. And the third?
The third driver is basically straight out of modern organizational theory. Diversity itself is valuable. Having greater diversity of talents, life experiences, and perspectives within decision-making teams genuinely leads to better outcomes. It leads to more robust debate, more innovative problem-solving. So in this view, the reservation policy isn't just about equity. It actually acts as a mechanism for talent optimization, forcing the organization to consider viewpoints and skills it might have otherwise completely excluded.
So, this empirical data, at least from this major study, really moves the argument. It suggests it's not just about a moral obligation versus efficiency. It might be that diversity, driven by reservation, can demonstrably contribute to efficiency, at least in certain contexts. Now let's try and zoom out from the railways specifically and connect this to the bigger picture of India's overall macroeconomic efficiency.
Right. Because even with these positive findings in a specific controlled environment like the railways, it's undeniable that India, as a whole, faces these deep underlying challenges in resource allocation. Global economic studies consistently show that the misallocation of human capital across different sectors, basically, having the wrong people in the wrong jobs or sectors for their skills, explains a significant chunk of the variation in output per worker that you see across different countries.
And how do economists usually try to measure that cost? What are the models they use?
Well, for many years, the standard tool was the Cobb-Douglas, or CD, production function. Using that model, estimates suggested that human capital misallocation could account for maybe 21% of the output per worker variation globally.
Okay, 21%. But the material we looked at pointed out a pretty major potential flaw in relying only on that Cobb-Douglas model, especially in this context.
Yes, exactly. The Cobb-Douglas model makes a key assumption. It assumes what's called unitary substitution elasticity. Now, in plain English, that basically means it assumes that human capital, skilled labor, and physical capital, things like machinery, factories, are easily substitutable for each other. If you have less skilled labor, the model assumes you could just compensate by adding more machines, and vice versa.
But that doesn't sound quite right, does it? Surely you need skilled people to operate complex machinery effectively.
Precisely. Modern economics increasingly argues that human capital and physical capital aren't perfect substitutes. They're often complements. You need skilled people to design, operate, manage, and maintain sophisticated physical capital. They work together.
So if you use a different model, one that treats them as complements, what happens to that estimated cost of misallocation? Does it change?
It changes significantly. If you use a more flexible model, like the constant elasticity of substitution or CES model, which explicitly allows for the possibility that human and physical capital are gross complements, the estimated global cost of misallocation drops quite a bit, down to about 15%.
So from 21% down to 15%. That implies the simpler Cobb-Douglas models might actually be overestimating the negative economic impact of human capital misallocation worldwide.
That's the implication. Yes, the way capital and labor interact matters a lot for these calculations.
Okay, so understanding that modeling nuance, what does it mean for India specifically? Where does India sit on this spectrum of inefficiency according to these studies?
Well, even with the revised lower estimates from the CES model, India still shows up as having one of the largest potential gains from reallocating its human capital better. It highlights really deep systemic allocative inefficiencies in the Indian economy. Under the older CD model, the potential gain for India from reallocation was estimated at a huge 40%.
40%.
Yeah. Even under the more realistic CES model, it's still around 34%. That points to a massive underlying inefficiency in how talent and skills are matched to jobs and sectors across the country. It's a structural problem.
And this seems like a really critical nuance. Despite this massive underlying inefficiency, the studies also found that the actual movement of human capital that did happen in India, say between 1995 and 2007, that movement actually contributed positively to economic growth during that period.
It did. That's a key takeaway. While there are clearly profound pre-existing inefficiencies deeply embedded in the Indian economy, structural, cultural, systemic ones, the data doesn't allow you to just point the finger at reservation policies as the single catastrophic driver of economic ruin. The reality is far more complex. And, as the railway study suggests, in certain controlled environments, the policy might even be contributing to positive gains, or at least not hindering them.
Okay, that complexity sets the stage perfectly for tackling the whole brain drain argument head on. Because the popular narrative, the one my friend experienced, is that reservation policies are the primary reason highly skilled Indians, the IIT, the IOM graduates, are fleeing the country. We really need to investigate this phenomenon, this brain drain, and its real implications for India's human capital.
Yeah, that narrative that reservation is the main or even sole cause, it really faces some intense scrutiny when you compare it to the actual structure of the Indian job market, as your opening anecdote hinted at.
What's the fundamental mismatch between the narrative and the reality there?
It boils down to scale, really. These reservation policies, even with the recent EWS edition, they only apply to jobs in the public sector. That means government services, public sector companies, publicly funded universities and colleges. Now, how big is that public sector in terms of overall employment in India?
It's tiny, isn't it?
It's incredibly small. It accounts for maybe 2 to 4% of total jobs in the country. 2 to 4%. So to blame this minuscule sliver of the job market for the exodus of literally millions of skilled professionals, well, as some of the source material quite bluntly put it, it seems absurd and dishonest. It completely ignores the other 96% of the economy.
The vast, vast majority of the economy, the private sector, which is not subject to government reservation quotas. But, and this is crucial, this supposedly meritocratic private sector seems to have its own kind of hidden system, what some might call an implicit reservation.
That's the other side of the steel grid, perhaps. There was one study referenced in the materials that found something quite startling. Within the top 50,000 companies in India, upper castes, specifically Brahmin and Banya communities, occupied something like 94% of the top leadership positions.
94%.
94%. So while there's no government mandate, there appears to be this inherent, maybe cultural or network-based hegemony that effectively ensures a massive overrepresentation of certain communities at the top, and consequently the exclusion of others. Individuals from backward castes frequently report facing discrimination, subtle or overt, during hiring and especially during promotion processes in this meritocratic private space.
So it creates this kind of impossible situation, doesn't it? This feeling of being blocked by a steel grid seems to apply almost universally, just for different reasons. If you're highly qualified but you come from a traditionally privileged group, you might blame the 2-4% public sector reservation for any setbacks.
Right.
But if you're highly qualified and you come from a backward caste, you run smack into the private sector's, let's call it 94% implicit upper caste dominance, which blocks your path there. It feels like a lose-lose structure that inevitably pushes talented people from all backgrounds to look elsewhere.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the question, what are the overwhelming drivers of migration that people actually cite?
Well, when you ask the migrants themselves or look at surveys, the reasons given for leaving are overwhelmingly economic and related to overall quality of life. The core motivations that come up again and again are the search for a dramatically better standard of living, the sheer earning potential, earning in dollars or euros versus rupees, and it's just an overall perception of better quality of life. That includes things like better infrastructure, maybe less bureaucratic hassle, sometimes less intense social pressures.
And alongside those pull factors, we absolutely cannot ignore the simple, maybe even painful reality of the sheer lack of sufficient domestic opportunity for the number of skilled people India produces.
Explain that a bit more.
You have this immense population density, combined with what is frankly a relatively inelastic supply of truly high-quality educational seats and, crucially, desirable high-value jobs. It creates this incredibly intense, often exhausting rat race just to get ahead. So many highly qualified individuals, regardless of their caste category, end up being pushed abroad simply because the domestic system cannot absorb all of them into roles that match their skills and aspirations. There just aren't enough top-tier opportunities to go around.
And for many, the path abroad starts with education, doesn't it?
Very often, yes. Many realize that pursuing, say, a Master of Technology, M.Tech degree in India, might be perceived, rightly or wrongly, as inferior to getting a master's degree from a well-regarded foreign university. So they migrate initially for higher education. And once they've established themselves academically, maybe built a social network abroad, then settling there permanently often becomes the logical and easier next step.
Now, there's an interesting little twist, or maybe an irony, regarding affirmative action when we talk about the success of Indians abroad. Some sources suggest that the remarkable success of non-resident Indians, particularly in places like the US, UK, or EU, might have been, paradoxically, sometimes aided by the very affirmative action or diversity policies in those countries, policies designed to promote non-white representation.
It's an interesting point. The idea that they might benefit from diversity initiatives overseas, but as you say, there's a counter-irony, or at least a significant complication to that narrative.
Which is?
Which is that other analyses, and frankly a lot of current debate in the West, suggests that Asians, and specifically Indians, are often statistically overrepresented in many elite Western universities and high-skill industries, particularly in tech and medicine.
Right.
Consequently, they may now actually find themselves disadvantaged by certain current diversity and inclusion rules in some highly competitive spheres, especially if those policies are now focused on boosting representation for other underrepresented minority groups. So it's definitely not a simple story of Indians straightforwardly benefiting from AA policies overseas. It's much more complex.
Okay. But regardless of what happens overseas, let's circle back to the structural disadvantages faced by students within India who did manage to get access through reservation. Because even for those who successfully use the quota system to enter, say, premier engineering colleges, they often find themselves hitting another wall when they try to enter the job market afterwards.
Yes. This post-admission exclusion is a critical piece of the puzzle, and it happens even in this supposedly meritocratic private sector, particularly in the massive IT industry, which is such a huge engine of high-value employment in India.
How does that exclusion work? What's the mechanism?
Well, the Indian IT industry, many major companies, employ these extremely rigid, often quite high academic mark requirements as an initial screening filter. They often demand, say, 70% or 75% aggregate marks consistently, right from the 10th standard onwards, just to even be considered for an interview.
Okay, high marks consistently from school onwards. Why is that a systemic exclusion mechanism for quota students?
Because it completely ignores the massive disparity in resources and quality across the Indian school education system. Students who gain entry to good engineering colleges via government quotas often did so with lower initial cutoff marks, precisely because they likely came from under-resourced backgrounds, maybe rural schools, maybe lower quality public schools. They were competing on a fundamentally unequal playing field right from the 10th standard or even earlier.
So they proved they could handle the engineering curriculum once they got in.
Exactly. They proved their capability by succeeding in a demanding engineering program. But then the private sector turns around and uses those historical pre-college marks, which reflect unequal opportunity much more than just inherent capability, to immediately slam the door shut on many of them. They get screened out before they even get a chance to show what they can do.
So even when the reservation policy successfully gets them through the door of higher education, the hiring practices of the supposedly meritocratic private sector can effectively terminate the benefits right there, preventing many from reaching the higher levels of corporate and technological power. It really confirms that these systemic blockages, this steel grid, persist in multiple forms, regardless of the reservation system itself.
And this constant friction, these blockages, the feeling of unfairness on all sides, it leads us directly into the political volatility and the societal instability that surrounds this policy. Reservation, unfortunately, often functions less like a stable piece of social engineering and more like a potent political tool. And the result is this relentless pressure, constant attempts to expand quotas, tinker with the rules through both legislative action and endless judicial challenges. It makes the entire system feel inherently unstable, perpetually divisive.
You really see the political weaponization of caste identity constantly, don't you? I mean, in recent decades, we haven't just seen protests from those historically excluded from reservation, but these huge, often violent agitations from powerful, dominant landowning castes. Groups like the Jats in Haryana, the Marathas in Maharashtra, Patidars in Gujarat, Gujars in Rajasthan.
Exactly. These are groups that were historically considered socially dominant, often economically powerful, and yet they are now demanding to be reclassified, often as OBCs or sometimes even STs.
Why? What does that tell us?
It illustrates just how valuable that reserved pool of resources, primarily government jobs and seats in higher education, has become in the perception of many communities. They see it as a route to security, to opportunity, perhaps in a way that their traditional economic bases no longer guarantee, and they're willing to essentially campaign for a downgrade in their official social status and sometimes engage in widespread disruption and violence just to gain access to these quotas. It highlights the perceived scarcity of opportunity.
And we absolutely can't forget the sheer scale and intensity of historical protests that these policies have triggered over the years. You mentioned the implementation of the Mandel Commission recommendations in 1990.
Yes, the anti-Mandel protests were massive, widespread, and deeply polarizing. They shook the country.
And then again, in 2006, you had another wave of severe anti-reservation protests, that time largely led by forward caste students and doctors, protesting the extension of OBC quotas into elite medical and engineering institutions. These events really underscore the profound societal fragmentation, the erosion of national unity that can result from this perpetual conflict over quotas.
And the rules themselves are constantly in flux, which adds to the instability. A really fascinating legal and political battleground has been around reservation and promotions within government jobs.
Right. That's different from initial hiring. What's the story there?
Well, the Supreme Court, back in that 1992 Indrasani case again, initially ruled against reservation and promotions, deeming it unconstitutional as it could compromise efficiency and seniority principles.
Okay, so the court tried to draw a line there.
It did. But the political system immediately countered. The parliament stepped in through constitutional amendments. Several amendments were passed quite rapidly, starting around 1995, specifically designed to override the court's ruling and ensure that reservation and promotions could legally continue.
So the legislature basically overruled the judiciary on this point.
Effectively, yes. But those amendments came with a very important caveat, a significant burden placed squarely on the state governments.
Which was?
The amendments and subsequent court interpretations essentially mandated that states, if they wanted to implement reservation and promotions, had to continuously collect quantifiable empirical data. They needed data to prove three specific things for each cadre or service. First, the continued backwardness of the specific SEST group in question. Second, the inadequacy of their representation at that promotional level. And third, crucially, that implementing reservation and promotions would not adversely affect overall administrative efficiency.
Wow. That sounds like a massive ongoing administrative and legal burden, continuously proving backwardness, inadequacy, and no impact on efficiency.
It is. It means these policies are constantly vulnerable to legal challenges. Every few years, states find themselves back in court, having to re-justify the policy with fresh data, proving inadequacy of representation all over again. It keeps the legal status of reservation and promotions perpetually uncertain and highly litigated. And beyond caste and promotions, the complexity of quota design just keeps growing. We're now seeing the inclusion of what are often called horizontal quotas, which cut across the vertical caste categories, designed to address other forms of marginalization, like gender or identity.
Right, like reservations for women.
Exactly. Many states now have horizontal reservations, sometimes setting aside up to, say, 33% of posts within each category, general, SE, ST, OBC, for women, particularly in government jobs or local political bodies. It shows the system trying to adapt to address gender inequality alongside historical caste inequality.
And it's expanding beyond gender too, isn't it?
Yes. Even more recently, you've seen the system begin to explicitly include transgender people. States like Karnataka and I believe West Bengal as well have introduced a specific, usually small, say 1% horizontal reservation for the transgender community within government services.
And then finally, there's the really thorny issue of religious quotas. That always seems to generate the most friction legally and socially.
It does, because the Constitution generally prohibits discrimination based solely on religion. So, religion cannot be the only basis for a quota. However, states have found ways to provide reservations for groups identified as socioeducationally backward within religious minorities.
Can you give us a concrete example of how that actually works on the ground?
Sure. In Tamil Nadu, for instance, they have historically partitioned their larger OBC reservation pool. Within that pool, they specifically allocate, I think it's 3.5% each, for socioeducationally backward Muslims and Christians identified within the state.
Oh, okay. So it's tied to backwardness, not just religion itself.
Precisely. Similarly, even at the central government level, there's a list of specific Muslim communities that have been identified and classified as OBCs, making them eligible for the standard central OBC quota based on their assessed social and educational backwardness, not purely on their religious identity. It's an adaptation, trying to recognize that exclusion and backwardness can unfortunately exist within specific religious groups as well.
Okay, so if we try to synthesize everything we've covered in this deep dive, it seems abundantly clear that the standard narratives around meritocracy, economic collapse caused by reservations, and brain drain being solely driven by quotas.
Right.
While they're highly complex, often heavily politicized, and certainly not supported unilaterally by the evidence.
Absolutely. The evidence we've discussed, particularly that powerful empirical study from the Indian Railways, simply does not support the generalized notion that reservations automatically crash the economy or inevitably lead to gross inefficiency. Remember, that study found no adverse effect on overall productivity and actually found a surprising positive association with productivity in top-tier managerial jobs.
So the real source of the friction, the feeling of that steel grid that blocks people, it seems much more multi-layered, doesn't it? It feels like a volatile combination of genuine historical caste injustice that the policy tries to address, compounded by immense population pressure, creating that intense domestic rat race for scarce opportunities.
And then you have the widespread, often unchallenged, implicit caste discrimination persisting within the massive private sector, which operates outside formal quotas but clearly has its own exclusionary mechanisms.
And layered on top of all that is the relentless political maneuvering that keeps the reservation policy itself in constant flux, making the whole system feel unstable and unpredictable, arguably forcing highly talented people from all backgrounds to look abroad for stability, predictability, and opportunity.
Exactly. The problem seems deeply structural and cultural, operating both within and outside the formal reservation policies themselves. I mean, when the private sector uses metrics like high historical academic marks that demonstrably reflect unequal educational opportunity from childhood, to screen out talented quota students who've already proven themselves in higher education, well, that proves that the system, writ large, often ensures the benefits of equity fail to penetrate the highest echelons of corporate power. The grid remains.
Which leads us to a final thought. So much of the national conversation, the political energy in India, seems fixated on fighting over the efficiency, the ethics, the distribution of the reserved portion of the opportunity pool, whether it's 50%, 60%, 75%. But perhaps the real drain on the country's future isn't just the tragic loss of some talented individuals to emigration, as painful as that is. Perhaps the bigger drain is the immense political energy, the national focus, the societal goodwill consumed by decades upon decades of this perpetual zero-sum argument over how to slice up a seemingly limited set of resources. Maybe the focus needs to shift from arguing over the distribution towards leveraging India's massive, undeniable potential in human capital to exponentially increase the size of the entire national opportunity pie for everyone.